Hello, everyone. We have finished our Let's Play of Spec Ops The Line, and we're going to actually talk about it in a deeper level. This game came out a few years ago, and there are many arguments pro for it, on what it's trying to say behind it. Everyone says it's a questioning of the main art style and the art of the design of modern military shooters. Me personally, I feel it is more of an anti-war and a warning against what we do to men when we ask them to go to war and stuff like that. Now, I'm going to open up to the floor of everyone who's joined me today: Mad Cat, Rachel Edwards, Nefnor, and Dean Esme.
I it's interesting because I was just discussing not this game, but the concept of warfare, and I have a very divided view of warfare. In fact, some of my views would probably be considered shockingly right wing by some when it comes to military conflict. At the same time, I recognize what a horror it is, and why warrior responsibly is it is not the worst of all things. It is not, but it is one of the worst of things. And it does. The game didn't really get into this much, but you have to ask yourself. It did explore the themes of mental breakdown and such caused by all that extreme violence, right? And there's some real truth to that. No, there's not some real truth. It's mostly true. War is hugely traumatic for those that go through it. I think even the ones who go through it and seem unfazed, like they thrill in it, you can tell something's wrong with them. Um, and yeah, at the same time, we have this ethos that's out there that war is something. I don't know. Men wage war, which is bullshit because it elides the reality that women are frequently contributors to the situation directly. They just don't go. But more to the point, most men actually have to be driven into it, and they won't do it for long. This is why militaries have these codes of honor for escape, because most would leave if they didn't face punishment.
Well, I want to
And
comment.
I want to finish with this, and I'll let you comment as you wish. That a thing that was discovered in the early 20th century, which was a real issue. They started applying the science of statistics and surveys and such like that. No, basically social science, real social science to the military, and they actually studied men in the combat field in wartime combat, and were shocked to discover that the majority of trained soldiers in combat, most of the time intentionally shot to miss, and many never fired at all in combat, even in intense combat situations, which caused militaries to invent new training procedures to break them down and make them fire unthinkingly. Well, not unthinkingly, but sort of automatically, basically overcoming their natural instincts not to kill. Which, if you think about it, is probably why you have PTSD, things like that, because men don't enjoy killing each other as a rule. And I liked seeing how, at least in this game, that kind of mental breakdown happens to people who go through these things for real.
What game?
Thank you, Dwight, for
Well,
joining us. We are talking philosophically and intellectually on Spec Ops: The Line.
Oh, okay. Uh, did I walk in on something that's being recorded?
Yeah, there's no problem about that joining
Okay.
in. It's just that
Okay.
we're recording it. You can join in.
well, I wanted to comment, kind of touch on what Dean was talking about and expand it a little bit more. Is that with the concept of war and so many things that men have to deal with, going out and earning a job is considered to be a necessary thing for men to do. To fix up the house, it's a necessary thing for men to do. Um, and war itself, going off and fighting for your country. And we start inventing these words like duty and honor that actually mean nothing, but are just words that instill this sense that, you know, as a man, this is my destiny. This is something I have to do to prove myself as a man. And we've developed a society that's built around this. But it's not just that men feel this need to do it, but it's the society around them. Uh, Other men, women, children that actually idolize people who go to war. Now, I have a mixed feeling about war, but for the most part, I'm against it. There are times when war is necessary. For the most part, especially as of late, it just seems frivolous that we'll go to war almost over anything in this world because we have the means. What's problematic, though, and this is where I was touching on with Dean, is that, he's talking about soldiers who don't want to kill. Well, there are people, especially during World War II and the Korean and Vietnam's war, who were draft dodgers. They didn't want to go to war and they ran off. I believe Canada was the place they went to. And we just looked at them as cowards. How dare you not go into the military and die for your country, forced to kill other people? How dare you do that to this country? If you were a real man, you would just go into the army, kill other people, and destroy any sense of identity you had. Whatever made you who you are, you're not allowed to have that because we need you to go do this. And that is the real problem with warfare, is that people are being forced to fight in something they don't even necessarily need to understand. That some politician somewhere is saying, you know what, let's send a bunch of these young men to go fight this war for us. And if they win, it's good for all America. And if they lose, oh, well, we can get more. And, I think that's something that's really embraced in this game, Spec Ops: The Line, is they were just grunts. They were just there to go carry out orders, and that's it.
I actually have to say I think the Elkin thing was to actually, and this is I think the one major focus that really caught me was the breakdown of Captain Walker, and it's a slow process that it is his own personal story, and it does in gameplay wise, mechanically, everything starts to shift and change bit by bit, ounce by ounce, and it doesn't exactly hit you hard and fast right away. It allows it to be subtle, to creep up on you. As much as I have problems with the mechanics being bombastic and Michael Bayish, there are enough points that really drag it to show you're asking men to do horrible things for king and country, if you even want to argue that point, and it takes its toll. And every male character, you got to see them slowly break down, slowly deteriorate. And one of the great things mechanically and visually with this game, you did see it like that. You did see these parts where the characters physically looking just ripped apart and destroyed. You can hear it in their voices. Even the little text on screen that is giving you orders slowly, inch by inch, changed in a natural progression where it would not feel a shock to you by the end. Even mechanically with the execution mechanic, you saw clean ones in the beginning, which they were quick pop, no thought about it. And the further you went down, you saw him visibly become more monstrous and brutal in his attacks and actions, where the same effort, just a simple shot, would have been done. And it's showing that when you're asking men to do this, you're asking men to pretty much bring out a demonic side, an evil side to them that most men don't have and don't want to even engage in whatsoever. It's one of those things that you even saw Lugo, when they used the white phosphorus on the civilians accidentally. You heard him screaming. He turned us into monsters. He made us killers. He himself is seeing and reacting and is living with that responsibility of having to use lethal force. And what hits the most way is that he's actually looking and he cannot hide from the consequences of his actions, even though bit by bit, step by step, he is trying to do the right thing. It's the conundrum and quandary with there's a specific rule in the military where you can technically you can disobey orders that are given to you if they're unethical. And as much as I would love to say that's a great idea, the problem is it forces the soldier to take even just more punishment because you don't follow orders. You can be hung and tried. You can have a just immediately you're popped out of there, executed because you're disobeying a direct orders in a conflict zone.
And so it's pretty clear that this game wants to explore those issues, which I actually applaud it for, which is weird because I'm also one of those people who thinks you don't get rid of war by just saying, I'm not going to go to war, because it's going to come to you. And there will be war, and we will continue to see war for the rest of our lives, almost certainly. So it's like, it's this thing that's going to happen. And so it's like you can sit there and see, I know somebody's going to be sitting there saying, no, it doesn't, just don't go fight. Well, no, I'm sorry. Yes, it does. I've talked to plenty of people who've walked in other countries who've watched the other guys run through their place and take them over. And so, I mean, I noticed that there was some talk when we were talking about that last episode about how there's a European-made game. Where it was made again?
I'm not exactly. I'll be googling it in backgrounds, but I'll tell it to you once you when you continue your thought.
Whoever and I don't begrudge them. You know, they're allowed to be critical of the U.S. military, and they're allowed to take a strong anti-war stance. On the other hand, this is a perspective that's not stated very often, or often enough. I do sometimes get tired, real tired, of European lecturing of the Americans in particular. Those people are sheltered from war largely by us, have been for more than half a century. They talk shit about us and our supposed empire and our supposed oppression, but anytime we talk about leaving Europe, leaving NATO, pulling our bases out, the host countries, including places like Germany, get really upset and say, no, don't. And when there's some problem in the Balkans or somewhere in Africa, they piss and moan about everything they don't like we've ever done. And who do they look to go into and take care of what their leaders actually believe need to be done? And so I know that's a long way of going and saying America's not above above criticism, but I'm sick of hypocrites who live under our protection and then shit on us for it. So make of that what you will.
It was from Berlin, Germany. That's their headquarters.
No, fair enough.
And to add to that, Dean, Europe,
Germany, which still has extensive military bases, which their governments have for half a century said, no, please don't leave. Yeah, go ahead.
Europe really didn't do anything pre-World War II when Hitler was coming to power. I mean, the world recognized the threat that Hitler had. I mean, he invaded Austria, and Europe just kind of sat back. It's like, okay, well, he's done that. He's not going to do any more. And in the end, it really was the United States coming in. And it's a little bit more complicated than that. I do acknowledge that.
Sure.
But when the United States really came in, it made a huge dent in the war. And I think that really establishes what you're saying there, Dean, is that Europe, I mean, they have a long history of warfare, but somehow in the 20th century, they kind of took a step back from it.
And became the ones to lecture the whole rest of the world. And by the way, I have news for you. People like Vladimir Putin, love him or hate him, don't really care about European moral posturizing, do they? Most dictators don't. Syrians, you know, whether you're looking at the fascist governments in control in places like Syria, or crazy tard tin pot dictators all over the place, they really are not moved by pretty moral speeches. They just aren't. When people say even things like, "Oh, you're going to war over oil," oh, so you just figured we'll all be fine if we let crazy fucks who hate us have all the oil. That's going to work out so well. So yeah, I do get tired of simplistic discussions of these things, but that's not to say every military conflict is honorable or desirable. I just kind of wanted to get that out there.
Scruffy, I think you had something to say?
There is no Scruffy.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I have to unmute myself. Yeah, a lot of this has been said before. It's not treading over any new ground.
Oh,
You
well,
know.
fair enough.
War is bad. Well, no shit. If they'd approached us in a way that was different, even an anti-war message, it would have been interesting. But every point that was made by the developers, nothing new.
Actually, I want to disagree with you there just a little bit there, Scruff. Is while there was definitely an anti-war sentiment in this, there was also a pro-war sentiment at the same time. If you look at the story as a whole, what was it that what was the CIA actually trying to accomplish? And the CIA was the one that sent them in there to get some intel about what was happening.
Trying to get
But they were trying to prevent more or less World War III. By killing the few survivors that were left would have saved billions of lives. And I mean, in that way, it's a little bit on the pro-war side that it's sometimes necessary to do an evil action if the end result ends up being a greater good.
Well, from what I understood, and I didn't get to do a playthrough, but I mean, it looks like they did let you pick all kinds of different endings.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't get to follow the story from beginning to end. So I mean, how do you think there was an overall message to the game itself as a reviewer?
to a degree.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was open for interpretation. I think anyone could have pulled something out of it, but I don't think that the creators were trying to stuff a specific message down your throat. I think they were just showing it what it was, what it means to be in war, the lack of decision you have sometimes when it comes to war. And whatever you personally feel is the takeaway, that's your takeaway. Because so far, the developers have been very tight-lipped about what the moral of the story is.
In part, again, they did something that I actually have to give a lot of credit for. They left it open as to what actually happened.
Go.
All right, so Spec Ops: The Line. My typical criticism of first-person shooters is that it's mostly around the shooting. There's really not much to it. It's pretty straightforward. You're going to be shooting things, and so to me it often seems sort of simplistic. But I guess that it serves a purpose for people if that's the sort of game that they want to play. But the Spec Ops is different. Spec Ops has its plot interwoven in with what's going on there. It isn't something so loose that you can just kind of cast aside. It's a part of every portion of going through and investigating different things around you. It's there all around. It's unavoidable. It seems to be sort of this commentary on that kind of game where you don't typically question why you're there. You don't necessarily ask, why am I going off to this other country to go shoot up digital bad guys, and it's, well, not necessarily bad guys, but you know what I mean. And I really liked that about this. I liked that there was a plot, there was something there. It made you think about the sort of judgment calls you have to make in warfare. Ones that typically may not be as clear cut and dry as most people would think about. It's a different kind of morality that you need to sort of survive, which isn't necessarily black and white. It's more about what achieves the goal, what will lead to the best for all, and that's it's. I think it's difficult for most people to think about. It's not something that's like the whole white phosphorus scene. That was very obviously a decision that did not have to be made. That wasn't a decision you got to make. It wasn't necessarily something that needed to happen, and yet you did it anyway. With devastating results. So yeah, I would almost say that this is kind of presented as an art piece. It's not. It's more than just a first-person shooter game. It's more than just. my words are failing me here. But yeah, and it's quite stunning at times for something that can get so gory. The color, the use of color in the game, color harmony is fantastic. I've never thought of something being so so pretty while you're just mowing people down. So it's, I guess that's what I'd like to say. The symbolism is also interesting, but is it my sort of game? Probably not, but I do appreciate something that is a little bit different than the I don't know how many Call of Duty games that come out like every year. So yeah, there you are.
Well, Rachel, if you like the beautiful colors while killing things, you should see what Pyrovision in Team Fortress 2 is like.
I personally, oh god, what I was gonna say is that what I appreciate is my favorite thing to do is play cheesy music in the background, like music that you wouldn't typically expect, and then just go and kill things in a video game. And even better if it's a video game that already has that kind of cheesy music in the background coupled with beautiful destruction. So it's kind of fun. Love that contrast.
Well, something I wanted to touch on with what you're saying about that you didn't really have a choice with the white phosphorus scene, but it was also an unnecessary action. One of the things that Jaeger Studios got heavily criticized for is the fact that there was no choice in some instances, like the white phosphorus scene, that the player couldn't get around it. And the developers actually responded to this and said that you actually did have a choice. You could turn off the console. That the player always has a choice to turn off the consoles, but soldiers don't have that choice. That when they're given an order, they must follow it. Because if they don't, then they would be seen as a traitor to their country. And this game really featured that very well as like the ultimate no-win scenario. You just did what you were told, as a good soldier does.
There was also another thing. You did get to see civilians in this game, and a lot of them, I would argue, in many of their scenes, reacted naturally how you would expect a bunch of civilians in a war-torn zone to be acting. You had, in the beginning of the game, you really didn't see them, but you saw them. A few parts, like somewhere in the middle, they were being herded up by the damn 33rd. Yet again, these people are terrified, they're scared. And then comes that point with the white phosphorus that you didn't know, and it would make sense that there's a pivotal scene where the mother and the child are together, and they are set alight. That definitely would be a scene that would most likely happen in reality. And the further and further you go down, the civilians yet again are in their own way being broken down and losing their composure, which really does make sense and understandable so, because the moment the civilian population, I would argue, completely breaks down is the scene where the water is completely destroyed. For good and for bad, for that, what Mad Cat had said, like there's a sign that sometimes warfare can be a greater good to stop something infinitely worse from happening. It does show that when it comes down to it, people's survival will make them do a lot of horrible things, and they will never that level of civility will erode away when the comforts of life, food, and shelter are kind of to a certain degree taken away. And that last scene that you had with civilians was when Lieutenant Sergeant Lugo was being hung and strung up. And maybe the one thing that I did like, if you did look at there were men and women in that crowd railing and screaming at you and hanging Lugo. One of those things. Another thing, it did show that when the chips are down, when you need to survive, men and women can be equally violent and vicious monsters. Even if the anger is misdirected, we are both capable of monstrous actions, and we will both vehemently want blood for it. For if we have a perceived wrong to us or an actual wrong to us. And yet again, in that scene, you could open fire on the crowd, killing men and women. And they did not consider either one 100% equally safe. Though in the beginning scenes, most of the civilians were female, in several early scenes trying to hit that notion, protect the women folk, they're innocent people. But as it did break down, they did show that, yeah, men and women can do these things. Men and women can be evil, and you can actually they can be just as brutal and evil as any other human being. And it was one of those little subtle things that was shown in there, and they did not hide from it, but you would have to look for it to notice it. It was not like, bam, right in your face, but you had to slowly take it in, and if you started realizing how the crowd was composited, how it would make sense in that way. Nafinor, Chris, anything?
There's no one here but you.
No, you're here.
No.
Well, I mean,
Crystal.
Sorry, wrong button.
I only watched the two playthroughs, the two Let's Plays
Yeah.
with you guys. But I mean, from what I gathered, I mean, and just from what I know, like I have not really played Spec Ops: Aligned myself, but from what I know of the game, it was designed to. Well, basically, the entire game was designed with a very, very anti-war message. I mean, almost every part of the game, let's say when you're like stealthing up to an enemy that doesn't see you and doesn't know that you're there, like usually they'll, 2 or 3 of them will be having a conversation, and the conversation that they have is very humanizing. I believe there's one part where you're sort of on a staircase or something, and there's like 2 enemies below you, and they start talking about like their families and how they just want this to be over because they want to go home to their families. It's very humanizing.
At the same time, more than a bit silly. Oh, I'm just a few days till retirement.
That was us.
It was that level of cliche.
Wow.
Well, as much as it is cliche, there's a kernel of truth to that, and that is a good humanizing factor. It's kind of using a trope, but using it effectively, which is probably one of the good things about it, is that when they use these cliches, things and stuff like that, they did use them effectively, which I cannot completely knock them for. Mm-hmm. And they're there for a reason. I felt that in many cases that using those little quiet scenes, you can ignore them, you could rush through it, but it allows a person who wants to play the game, take their time with it, to actually engage in that, and not like, because that's the other thing, mechanically you could just blaze your way through that and not have any kind of like emotional tugging on your heartstrings. And I think that's what made it. I think that's the other thing, is like, from a gameplay perspective, it's what has that hit behind it, because the moment you take a second playthrough, you'll start noticing these little things bit by bit, type of thing.
Well, the other thing with that is there's a reason why things are a cliche. It's because to some extent they do happen a lot, and we're so used to it happening that we just kind of think it's cheesy when it happens. It's like the idea that stereotypes are based on some element
Mhm.
of truth. Cliches are based on something that does happen a lot. And when people are in the military in the middle of a war zone, they do think about their families. They do want to get back to their families. Most people don't want to be there. And that was something Dean was saying, is that, early 20th century, soldiers were purposely missing their enemy combatants or didn't fire their guns at all because no one wants to be in a war zone. It's just unfortunate we have to be sometimes.
No, I have to say there's one little thing that, as a whole, that I don't think. I think we're all skirting the subject, and it's nothing bad. It's just that male disposability, and it completely makes sense in this part of in this type of context, infinitely. And I think that's the biggest thing. It is there, and we kind of really didn't respond to it. And I think this is the other thing that kind of caught me, was that even while we were playing through Let's Play, we were laughing off, oh yeah, kill another one. Oh, Mike, you're missing your shots left and right. Can't you hit the broadside of a barn? We were still, in a sense of way, dehumanized to that factor that it's, oh, men are getting killed off. And everyone, when we saw that scene where the white phosphorus popped over the civilians and the mother with the child, we were all hit to our core with it enough to go, dear God, this is what we're doing. And it was focused on a female character, and a nameless female character at that. But I think that was a wise use of it, because it left a massive gut punch to shock you and going, this is what you're doing. And culturally, we will always see, we always have the sense of women and children are innocent, they must be protected, and all that kind of stuff wrapped around it.
At this point, I think that when I was saying it was cliche, there were a few moments that really did have more of a gut punch, that hit you just right in the feels. Personally, for me, like the children's drawings, that was far from original, and yet it was very effective at showing what was going on.
Another thing, you are right. You are right. The fucked up thing is that it sort of takes something like showing a mother holding a child to kind of humanize what's taking place here, because in everybody's minds, the thing that is the most obvious when it comes to civilians is women and children. Even if you have men who have no part in this, who aren't soldiers, and they get caught in the crossfire, people don't necessarily identify them as just being innocent bystanders. And that's... it's incredibly messed up that society doesn't recognize that at all.
Well,
And
it's probably
so-
one of
Yeah, go on.
it's probably one of the biggest cliches of all is, how bad someone is by how a woman is affected. If you want to make an evil, villainous guy, well, he rapes women, he kills women, he kills children.
That's
And
how
I
you
think,
do it.
Schultz, you're touching on a
Yeah.
very big part right there, is we only really reacted to it when we saw a woman and a child, though, to be fair, that was kind of shoved in our face. If that wasn't there, I think we would have had still pretty much the same reaction.
Something they could have done to make it more effective, and this goes back into mechanical failures, that they could have made the game more, made the AI better, or at least, I get that it's a full AI would have been hard, but all they had was some very basic action scripts, which failed to humanize the enemy combatants at all. And if they'd made the enemy combatants act quote unquote a little more human, I think that would have had a fairly dramatic effect.
Yeah.
It's one thing to kill a bunch of generic, aimless, generic, NPCs. It's an entirely different thing to kill a guy who's screaming "No, don't," and running.
Well, that's exactly right. Let's put it to you this way: once the concept of male disposability has actually been proposed to you, it's a little shocking, and sometimes we can go overboard with it. I mean, History, we say that history is largely the history of warfare, and actually that's not really true. Wars are just memorable. The pace and the scale at which wars happened and the number of combatants involved. I mean, most men never went to war. That's history. Most men never did. It's just it was understood when they needed to, they would have to, and they frequently had to be driven to it. It's the 20th century and now the early 21st century where we're actually experiencing war on this scale. It's never happened like this before. And so, like with a lot of other things, you can make the case that war actually, in the 20th century, let's put it to you this way, a totalitarian regime like communism or Nazism could not have worked without technology. Just couldn't be done. You can't, you couldn't openly insult the king 200 years ago, but when push came to shove, the king didn't give a shit what you were doing 99% of the time, as long as you weren't disrupting the kingdom. Governments coming in and trying to control everything, and all this mass media has also led to an increase in slaughter. We've never had wars to the scale that we did in the 20th century, or they were very rare and always hugely memorable.
We did have stuff like the Roman versus Hun battles.
Oh yeah, but even those, one of those, I mean, most of the Roman conquests, they just rolled in, and it didn't take them that long to win because they were just so much more efficient, right?
Yeah, but in the battle with the Huns, that was so bloody. Both sides kind of limped out of that with most of their troops lost, which was rare for that time even. And
yeah,
it was so
and that's a really memorable battle.
Exactly.
That's one battle in a century kind of thing, and most guys weren't there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's worth remembering that sometime. It's not like we are biologically designed to lose males at that pace. I'm sorry, we're not. If you look at the biological record, it's much more like that male disposability thing is the emergency escape hatch, and it never goes that well for the kids or mom when that emergency escape hatch is pulled. It really doesn't go well. Fathers aren't that disposable. They really aren't.
I think a lot of times people. I'm just going to criticize.
So I'm saying it's cultural. And we've come to accept a level of it, even in our entertainment, that's a little interesting.
I think this is going to where I think I differ from most other MRAs, but I think again, male disposability isn't as bad as you think it is. It's only a ratio of 2 to 1, something like that. Because when you lose too many men, you don't have genetic diversity anymore.
That's true.
Fast.
I don't think you diverge. I think a lot of people in the manosphere really grossly exaggerate the level of male disposability throughout history. They really do.
Yeah.
The level of carnage we've seen the last century or so is really unprecedented in how bad it is.
Well, again, if you think about it, you have a country like China goes under communist rule, loses 50 million people, not due to direct murder, but due to mismanagement, and then promptly goes back to even more people, recovers and goes back. So yeah, what you're saying about we've never seen slaughter on the scale, absolutely true.
I'm going to stop you there and turn it over to Panina.
Hey guys, I wanted to comment on something that I find interesting, at least with the game mechanics. I know that you guys are talking about the more social meetings and whatnot, and I think this kind of plays into it, and it goes back to what you were talking about in humanizing these characters, even the background characters. What I like to examine in games like this are the visuals, in the respect of visual cues, Easter eggs, and just little tidbits of information that you pick up along the way that start to kind of tell a story story in and of itself, not just the one that's presented to you or what your character goes through, but getting a bigger sense of the environment around you, such as when Schultz was going through that, I think it was like a mansion or something, and we saw the hangings of the pictures of the dogs, like those portraits of these different kind of dogs, telling you a little something about who owned the place, what they liked. I heard somebody mention uh, the the kids' drawings, and just other things along the lines of like when transitioning from one zone to another, how things can get darker or hazy, and it starts to set the mood and what you should be expecting as you go into another place, another area, and not not necessarily foreboding, but again, just adding to the ambiance and the story overall. I think even for like silly things, not necessarily things that might be relevant to the story, but let's say a soldier has a Yoshi and Mario plush on his desk at work. Not particularly in this game, I've seen it in another game. But it adds a little personality to just go, again, like the soldier's talking about wanting to go home. It reveals little bits of information that when you stop and you examine it for a moment, it gets you to think, who are these other people? And what is it about them that makes you go, oh, that is so cool that that's there, and making it kind of relatable.
This is actually a good way of changing the subject to something a little lighter, but I really did like the artwork that I was seeing there, and the art and the architecture and all that. I really did like how they were putting that together. They did a real nice job.
I also liked how extravagant everything looked. It looked like this was a place where rich people were, that nothing was really designed for civilian or for lower class. It was all upper class. We saw gold everywhere. We saw statues of peacocks everywhere. We saw an aquarium, and that's how Dubai is. I'm not trying to say anything bad about Dubai, but I think it really captured what it was, and almost like you were looking at the aftermath of a great kingdom crumbling.
Absolutely, and you're definitely seeing class division, things like that. I mean, the thing is that I don't know if all of the people who were, of course, left over were upper class individuals. I would actually say that probably the people there were folks who had to be this, provide services for all of the people there. Odds are the first people to get the fuck out of there were the richest people that were there. They probably had a plane out or something.
And it explicitly, remember, one of the planes you find is a plane of rich people who are out there.
Yep, pretty much. Exactly, which means there probably were some ones that were there that were successful in getting a lot of the most important people out. So who's left behind? People who don't have money to just go hop a plane and get the hell out of there.
Mm-hmm.
It's covering a lot of different things. And when we get back into the whole male disposability thing, one of the things that I noticed is you actually see the bodies pile up. You know what I mean? They're still there when after you're hitting them. They're still there. They're in your path and stuff like that. So you kind of have to walk over them. They don't just like disappear or anything like that. They're still there.
That kind of reminds me of the Titanic, when you had lifeboats and the women and children first, but they didn't even really put as many people as they could onto the lifeboats. There was a lot of empty seats because, hey, they were rich people. And at least that was what's in the movie. I believe that was actually also true. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. But that kind of seems like what was happening in Dubai is all these rich people wanted to leave. But it's like they probably had extra space where they could have put extra people on there. And they were thinking about their own mortality and not the welfare of others. And it's like a lot of poor people on the Titanic died when they might have been able to survive if the lifeboats allowed them to come on.
Well, just slightly going off topic, one of the issues with the Titanic was they never did proper drills to establish how many people should fit in a lifeboat, the proper procedures of when steerage and second class were allowed up on deck. So basically, it was the rich coming off first. And they didn't supply enough lifeboats on the ship to begin with to be able to get everybody off. Because they wanted more deck space instead of thinking that, oh, something could happen and we will need them. It was almost like inconvenience, but hey, for the sake of having lifeboats, to just skimp on by regulations for cross oceanic travel. Just anyways, slight history lesson.
Well, and that kind of plays into what happened in Dubai, at least, is that they weren't properly prepared for an emergency like that. Probably much for the same reason that they thought that in a way they were invincible, nothing bad could happen to them, and then a massive sandstorm and they were ill-equipped for it. And that's probably why the U.S. military was sent in the first place.
Well, and to add on to that, Dubai right now, a lot of famous terrorists are housed in Dubai. Want to know where the head of Hamas lives? It's not in Gaza with his boys. It's in Dubai.
Of course.
A lot of these terrorist groups, not just terrorist groups, but a lot of terrorist groups and political people who have enemies who are Arab and Muslim hide out in Dubai. Dubai is one terrorist attack away from losing a couple million people, and they've got an absolute army of people there who would have somebody willing to kill them for one reason or another.
Now, I like to add something to what Penina said earlier about the mechanics and like those little Easter eggs. There's one of those little things where you could click on those like collectibles in the game. It's a very little mechanic, and one of those things I have to say, in most games I roll my eyes at, but these added to the store and the lore to it. And yet again, another thing which, from a gameplay mechanic, I enjoy a lot because it allows the player to actually engage, and kind of tapping into that normal in human curiosity of figuring out what the hell happened. And we see that bit by bit the behind the scenes stories really come into focus, because there is a scene talking about a little doll, and he says, and the main character even says, this had to be made after the fall because you have diamonds for ears, you have pearls all over this thing, and yet again showing the humanity in a very hellhole-like situation, and kind of what, even if things fell apart, what would the parents, what would a mother and father do for their child to keep them happy, safe, and keep them calm in a very terrifying situation. And those little backroom stories that you can actually easily piece together. I know Scruffy even talked about the mural of painting is on the side of the wall, telling its own story. And I think that's the other thing, is like, it's the behind the scenes subtle storytelling that hits home. Even Rachel even said that they left the bodies. You have to go over the bodies. You can't hide from it completely, but you do see it, engage it, and I do think that the natural human curiosity that we have within us drives us to stare and try to figure it out and look at it. And I think that's one of the greater strengths of this game, is that it's not always what is just being told, it's sometimes what's not being said at all that really can be shocking, heartwarming, or even horrifying in its own manner.
Well, to speak to the situation with the doll, I mean, it kind of points out how utterly worthless all of this extravagance really is the moment that money no longer matters. When all that matters are things like food and water and stuff like that, and just surviving to the next day, things like diamonds and gold and all of these other things that we place value on have no fucking value anymore.
Well, I think that's also very apparent right away in the game. When you're coming up to Dubai for the first time, you see all of these really expensive cars, and they were just abandoned. And it's like, how much money was spent on these cars? This idea of acquiring wealth, and then when things really hit the fan, they were just abandoned. And it's, in the end, it was, as Rachel says, it was just your survival. And I don't know, I think that kind of makes us a little bit more aware about this over consuming population that we have, even capitalism, that we're just so invested about the things that we can have, and in the end they really mean nothing except being able to survive. And it's almost like our society doesn't prepare us at all for survival. It just wants us to keep spending money.
Yeah,
I would argue. I would actually argue not necessarily to spend money, but to be productive for the benefit of society, and they give you some compensation for your time that you just get taxed on anyways, and then spend on the system to make other people productive.
Well, I would take that one step further. Everyone to be productive so we can make the 1% richer. Because someone's getting all the money, and it seems to be the government and the very rich, while everyone else is sacrificing their money just to have enough food for the next paycheck.
I would like to have a discussion with you on that one a little later.
Well, okay. Well, if we're gonna get into this particular situation, there is something that needs to be acknowledged. The main problem is not necessarily that there are rich people in existence. It happens to be that instead of the money that they have going then back into circulation, it's just sort of staying in one place. That's kind of the problem.
And that's a problem of fiat currency, but we are kind of getting off the show topic. But what did you want to say, Dean?
I was going to say, if you look at any system, by definition, there will always be a top 1%. I don't think this game was necessarily about those socioeconomic things. At least that wasn't the impression I got. Although I do agree that anytime you look at war, there's competition for resources there. That's what most war is.
I don't think that was a central theme, but I think it was just like a minor Easter egg, a minor thing to just kind of put in there that is realistic, of how people built up all of these riches around them and then they had to abandon them. And in the end, what's really the most valuable thing of all? I think that's just a minor theme. I don't think it was anything major.
I would also like to bring up the PTSD issue. That was, I would argue, primarily the last 2/3 of the game. Historically, connecting it with that is that we've had PTSD since we've been beating each other's skulls with rocks.
Yep.
But the main reason why I want to talk about this is one of my teachers said PTSD only existed in the modern age, which I give him the right middle finger to that, which bothered me. But it was something that I when I did looking at this combat, the hours of combat and the amount of stress put on soldiers was roughly right around the Vietnam War, where it spiked exponentially. Previously, if you look about the actual combat times with World War II soldiers, they were relatively, in comparison, low. World War I was one of those other issues where they put fighting constantly on the soldier and put so much stress on them. You see World War II where there's that little bit, there was they had only so many weeks of combat, and it was Vietnam and post that where the amount of hours a soldier was put through this combat and stress radically and drastically spiked. And kind of I think that's the other thing with Spec Ops now, this part I don't think is intentional. I think it's just a byproduct of the story being telling. But when it's a special operations or active combat duty, this would be kind of the situation. You would be always on a knife's edge constantly, not able to even rest properly. You're always on guard, always worried, always concerned, always having to push forward. And in that sense of the gameplay, in that PTSD stuff coming up, I think it does do at least a significant active idea of, holy crap, this is what people are going through. This is what our men are going through when you're actually asking them for active combat. It's like they don't really honestly have a true moment's rest. Even when there's downtime, you're always doing something. You're always, even when there's nothing to do, you're doing something to keep your mind occupied because you can't properly detox, relax, and get proper R&R so you don't go stir crazy. Because you did see it with each character, slowly they're getting stir crazy. They're still fighting through it, and arguably this scene would probably seem to at least take a week or so. But that's a week of, I'd argue, intense combat.
We don't really know how much time passed for that, but something that I read about this game on TV Tropes, which kind of is up for debate, is did they actually eat and drink at all? Now, in video games, they don't normally show that actually happening, but it kind of raises the possibility that maybe in this game they didn't really eat all that much. And if that's the case, that could have also affected their mental
Deterioration.
their psyche. They were deteriorating faster because they couldn't really rest. They couldn't really eat anything. Maybe they had like a candy bar that they were eating from their MRE, but that was probably it.
Well, when you don't actually get a lot of rest, you can start to hallucinate. The higher the stress you're in, the worse it gets. It's just kind of paranoia kicks in, and I think, of course, it was definitely exaggerated, probably to some extent for the game. But yeah, it's people are pretty bad off.
Well, assuming again you were actually experiencing it, and you know what you saw wasn't just a massive overall hallucination.
You know, it's when we talk about PTSD, though, I will have to mention that in some part, up all the way through World War I, they shot men for that. They called it cowardice, and they still do all over the world.
Shell shock, actually.
Well, it was
come through
fucking
many different
PTSD.
names. It's
It's
many
the same
different names.
goddamn thing. It's the same goddamn thing. All you have to do is look what happened to them. They were being shot for cowardice for having PTSD reactions, straight up.
Even medieval times, and I think there was a period, Napoleonic era, home longing syndrome. I'm probably misphrasing it, but pretty much they had PTSD, the longing of getting out, and that was kind of one of those things that even then popped up. They just said so many different names for it.
Yeah, and I think that was part of the problem with what you were saying, that we saw such a massive there's so many more cases in the Vietnam War, and I don't know if that's necessarily true. It's just that was about the time we actually started to recognize PTSD as something really real, you know.
Yeah, except that just the scale of combat is so much bigger. That's all.
And perhaps,
No, not even.
maybe
perhaps.
we did see a lot more of it.
No, dude. There were millions who served in Vietnam. There weren't a million men in Europe in Roman times. So yeah, I'm just saying the scale is so much bigger.
Well, yeah, but in the medieval times there were over 1 million people, especially with everything that was going on during the 100 Years' War, at least in the early part, with people in France dying every few years. I mean, they had a mini ice age, they had a famine, they had the bubonic plague. People were dying constantly there, and with the bubonic plague itself, in the 10 years that it was there, it was 2.5 million people killed, and France was still fighting a war at the same time. And I think there was probably a lot of PTSD there. Part of the reason why the plague spread so much is soldiers left the army and went around to the various towns to escape from it. And I'm willing to bet that those people had PTSD.
Very possibly. I just meant the scale of the conflict can't be compared. They just
No,
can't.
I agree with that.
Now, that said, it is interesting to contemplate throughout history that plague and other things followed, but anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No, and you're perfectly right, dude. I'm not trying to take away with what you're saying. I'm a very factual guy, so if I hear something that I don't agree with, I'm just going to call out on it. But you are 100% right. With the Vietnam War, that was probably one of the worst wars ever. I mean, you might be able to the Romans and the Huns and all of that and how bloody that was, but I would still give it to the Vietnam War because that was just a slow battle that involved so many people and, you know. But going back to the discussion about PTSD, I mean, it's like now we're fully aware of it, but it's like our society has no respect for it whatsoever, and that's what disturbs me most of all. And not to get too political with this, but it's like now people are saying that they can get PTSD just being on Twitter. And it's not even the people are saying it, it's their psychologists are saying it. And it's like, how could a medical professional equate to something you witness on Twitter be the same thing as being forced to kill someone in combat? And that's what disturbs me even more about PTSD is we finally recognize it, and now we've taken all the way to the other side of just disrespecting anyone who actually has PTSD.
Well, I actually think Terrence Popp recently did a video, and if I can remember, I'll link it down below, where he does bring up and talk about PTSD. Very well done. And I think that's the bigger thing is that we're not having that rational look at things, what causes it. And yet again, when you look at this game, it would make sense that horrific trauma, horrific events that are life-shattering and life-changing would cause some type of psychological mental backlash. And the mind and body is just trying to survive a very horrible situation type of thing. And I think as things are going on, I think we're getting close to wrapping up, and like we can actually Penina, you had something you wanted to say?
I just wanted to point out one other thing that I've noticed a lot with the devaluing of PTSD, where I've started to see in the past few years people claim that they have anxiety and post-traumatic stress just from being around certain people that they know, people that they claim have harassed them or abused them. I don't know what the story, I don't get into it, but this is just things that I hear. And they claim that they avoid places because they know or have a feeling that that person that triggers their PTSD or their version of PTSD may be there, so they just avoid those places completely. And there are distinctions that I see with people that they have in their friend circle making there'll be one or two sides. There will be the one side that basically says, "Oh, hun, it's okay. You don't have to go. We're here for you. Just, hugs and feels." And then there is the other side that will sit there and say, "Well, you shouldn't avoid having a good time just because someone you don't want to be around may or may not be there. It's not like you're going there to see this person." And these same people will bring up that to get over anxiety, or get over is not the correct word, but in order to cope with it, cope with the anxiety and cope with the PTSD, is to put yourself in those places that may make you uncomfortable in order to start handling it and again coping with it. that it in a sense, it's almost like a disease. If you expose yourself to a sickness slowly but surely, your body starts to become immune to it, and so does with the mind. You may never ever be the same as you were before you got PTSD, but you can adapt yourself in handling yourself and the situation better, or at least enough to be able to, bow out without having an episode and getting to a more secure and comfortable space in order to calm down and get reclaim yourself.
Gentlemen, welcome to Dubai.